All right. So we're talking about the early markets, kind of the development of that initial large domestic market. As history goes on, as U.S. history goes on, as the U.S. kind of goes from this nascent nation into the this powerhouse that it is in the 20th century, this domestic market is going to be very important. So the U.S. has this huge advantage compared to other developed countries where it has a very, very large domestic market. So it has this large population, large interconnected domestic market. You can sort of gives U.S. companies a little bit of an advantage because they can take advantage of economies of scale within the country, so they can kind of build up their products, build up whatever their system is, test it out in the domestic market before entering into other markets. This becomes a huge advantage in the 20th century. And so in the context of the 19th century, the 1800s, we're going to look at, okay, what was the role of the federal government, or what was the process of developing this large internal market? All right, we're going to have kind of two big factors that we're going to be interested in: transportation. So building up that transportation network makes that internal market, larger and easier to get your goods kind of around the country. Essentially, if it's hard to get your goods from New York to South Carolina, well, then South Carolina is not really in your market. I mean, you're not really connected because it's just prohibitively expensive to get all the way down there. Second thing that is of much interest, as we get into the back half of the 1900s and even today, like a hotly debated topic is tariffs. And so oftentimes we look back to this period of U.S. growth, kind of like when the U.S. was, an undeveloped country as it initially industrializes, to sort of look at what the tariffs were there to try to draw lessons for developing countries today. I don't really think that comparison is applicable because of just the completely different environments, but it's one that's oft debated. And in both these cases, like, I think what's really important is a lot of times people say, oh, we have to learn from the past, and they look at, whatever happened in the past and they apply that to the present. Sometimes that's the right way to go about things. And certainly historians, that's kind of how we pitch ourselves. Hey, let us teach you about the past so you don't make the same mistakes. But sometimes the past is just drastically different than the present. And so, the context is totally different. So it doesn't really, the type of policies are not really directly applicable to the present. So it's also important to keep that in mind. For a road. All right. Obviously not the roads we have in the present. We're talking like mostly dirt roads. So we have this turnpike network that's initially built. England, by the way, prior to the Industrial Revolution, develops its own turnpike network that really precipitated the Industrial Revolution, or allowed it to happen, because it developed its own large internal market, which made selling textiles much easier. All right, then we get canals. All right, so this is like, canals are basically, everyone knows what a canal is, right? The tanker just got stuck in the Erie Canal. So now we all know what canals are. You just make, waterways that make it easier to move stuff around. But also importantly is steamships, because then it makes going upstream much easier. So it's very easy to go downstream. Obviously, you're going with the flow of the water, right? But to go upstream is a bit of an issue. All right, takes a little bit of work, but hey, once we got that steam, the steam does it for us. Okay. All right, and we can kind of look at those lowering costs, like freight costs. I mean, ultimately, that's really that's gonna tell us like how interconnected this market is. And when we go to the present, we're dealing with a globally connected market because transport costs are so low. I mean, they might not seem low, but relative to the past and like just how easy it is to ship things around the world now, I mean, basically we are dealing with a global market, at least where you're, as long as that like kind of inland transportation network is built up, the cost of the cost of shipping things around the world, um, uh, is so low. I'm trying to recall, like, there's this recent anecdote where it was like cheaper to ship something to Thailand to process it and then ship it back than just to ship it like overland within the U.S. To process it and then ship it somewhere. Sorry, I can't remember the specific anecdote. The point is, things are very it's very inexpensive. Things it's very inexpensive to ship in the present, likely just going to get cheaper. As I love to point out, solar energy is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So you can imagine these big tanker ships. Once if those things ran on solar or ran on nuclear, that it would be really cheap to. And if they were completely automated, which also would be a possibility. Then things will get really cheap. All right, but we're talking about the 1800s here. So turnpikes, you can see these get cheaper as kind of the turnpike network gets more well established. Here we have the upstream river rates, and you can see, boom, those really fall out. Those really fall off with the development of so here they are right here. Sorry, that's the canal rates. Here's the upstream river rates. Those really fall off as the steamship comes into widespread use. These things happen fast, by the way. One thing that's shocking when you look through the past at innovations is just the speed of adoption sometimes is shocking. So sometimes it takes a long time for an invention to kind of like filter out or be perfected, but then once it does, then boom, it gets adopted very fast. So this is the case with the steamship. Basically, there's no steamships, and then there's steamships. There's a famous picture of New York City. Where they take a picture of the city, and it's like all carts and buggies. Okay. Then they take a picture, I think 5 years later, or maybe even like 2 years later, and it's all cars. Once the innovation is ready, like once it's ready for, consumer use, sometimes it can get adopted very, very quickly. With thugs to try to beat each other for control of these railroad lines. All right, that's the back half. It doesn't get that exciting until the back half of the 1800s. All right, sorry, I'm very going on a lot of tangents tonight. I'm sorry about that. All right. Okay. So, okay, this gives you a snapshot of like kind of the modes of transportation and relatively when they were used. I mean, each of these steps is going to lead to a larger connected domestic market for U.S. entrepreneurs. All right, there's another way of looking at it. Here's just those upstream and downstream freight rates, and you can see they really reach parity in the 1830s. All right, this is when the steamship is adopted, and they get cheaper and cheaper. These are all adjusted for inflation. Not that there was much inflation in this time period, as we'll cover next week. Um, okay, here's your canal network. Again, as I'll highlight, this is really a northern phenomenon. The South is like backwards. I don't want to say backwards, not the right word. It's an agriculture plantation based society where most of the stuff is shipped via the Mississippi over here or through these waterways. The canal, that really interconnected market, this is really a northern phenomena connecting all these northern cities to each other. Okay, another way to look at this. So one way you can tell how connected places are is what are the price differences. If prices are largely the same in two locations, that essentially tells you that they are very connected. So oftentimes when we go through history and we want to see what was the level of trade between places? We look at prices. And if the prices are wildly different, that tells us that these places are not connected. Why is that? Well, where it's low, where the price is low, if trade was very, very cheap, I could just buy it there, ship it to the other place, sell it for less, undercut that market. And ultimately the prices would reach parity if it was easy to ship things there. So if prices are wildly different between places, that tells us that there isn't a high degree of trade. So when we look at this, what this is telling us is, okay, what were the prices in Cincinnati? How much lower were the prices in Cincinnati, which is kind of like where these crops were originating from? So these are things grown kind of in the hinterlands of, at that point, the hinterlands of the US. So we got flour, wheat, corn, and pork. So these stuff grown, essentially then shipped out of Cincinnati. So this is say so the price in Philadelphia, it's 63% of that. So if it was $1 in Philadelphia, it would be 63 cents in Cincinnati. So it's costing, in that example, 37 cents to ship it to Philly. So a couple different things you can glean from this. The closer these numbers are together, Philadelphia, New York, and New Orleans, is basically how interconnected those places are. And then obviously as they're getting closer to 100, that's telling us they're closer to is one of the US becoming more and more interconnected, having a larger and larger domestic market. Of course, the population is rising too. So the population is going up and these places are getting more and more interconnected. That facilitates economies of scale. That if I have a company, my company can get larger and larger because I have a bigger customer base. Okay, the government role in developing transportation. Let's take a bit of a break before we talk about the big G.